What if one of the greatest companies in history was built by a college dropout? And what if the biggest failure of your life wasn't actually the end, but the beginning of something truly legendary? Today, we're not just telling a story about success. We are diving into a masterclass on vision, on struggle, and on an absolutely unwavering belief in an idea. This is the leadership story of Steve Jobs.
So this really brings us to the big question, right? A question every single entrepreneur, every leader has to wrestle with. Can you actually build something that lasts, a real legacy from the ashes of what feels like a total disaster? I want you to keep that question in your mind, because the story we're about to unpack, well, it's maybe the greatest answer you'll ever find.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning. The story starts on February 24th, 1955. Steve Jobs was born in San Francisco, but his biological parents just weren't in a position to raise a child. He was adopted by this incredibly kind, working-class couple, Paul and Clara Jobs, who made one simple promise: he would go to college. And that was the start of a life that was going to be anything but ordinary.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. It's all about how his parents framed his adoption. When Steve was old enough to understand and ask questions, they never told him he was given up. They told him, "You were chosen." Just think about that for a second. The power in those two words. For a young kid, that phrase probably planted a seed, this feeling that he was different, that he was special, and maybe, just maybe, that he was meant to do something big.
And that feeling of being different, it really showed up in school. Steve was brilliant, no doubt about it, but he was completely bored. He hated the structure, the rigid rules, and was always challenging authority. But what happens when a really curious mind gets bored? It goes and finds its own adventure. For Steve, that was the family garage. His dad taught him all about electronics, and he just started taking things apart and putting them back together. And that right there, that lit the spark for a lifelong obsession with technology and beautiful design.
So his parents kept their promise. They saved up and he went off to Reed College. But in true Steve Jobs fashion, he dropped out after just one semester. But here's the twist. He didn't actually leave. He just hung around campus, sleeping on floors and dropping in on any class that looked interesting. One of them was calligraphy. At the time, it seemed completely useless, right? But years down the road, he said that class was the reason the first Mac had such beautiful, elegant fonts. It perfectly shows his whole philosophy. You can only connect the dots looking backward.
Okay, so in 1976, that passion for tech led him to team up with his buddy, the engineering wizard Steve Wozniak. And right there in that same family garage, they started a company with a name that was friendly, simple, and not intimidating at all: Apple. Their goal was, for the time, totally revolutionary. Take these giant, mysterious computers out of corporate basements and put their power into the hands of regular people. And they didn't just succeed, they exploded. The Apple II was a massive hit. It turned Apple from a couple of guys in a garage into a billion-dollar company basically overnight. I mean, this wasn't just building a business, they were starting a revolution. But that kind of crazy, rapid growth, it almost always comes with a price. By the way, if you're enjoying this explainer, please subscribe, there's a lot more coming. Because for Apple, that price was a storm that was brewing right inside its own walls. And this is the moment that defines the journey for so many founders. It's the ultimate test, the fall from grace. For Steve Jobs, it meant being exiled from the very kingdom he had built with his own two hands.
The year was 1985. Apple was a huge public company now, and that freewheeling, rebellious startup culture was starting to clash hard with a more traditional corporate board of directors. And the tension was really building between Jobs and the CEO he himself had hired to run the company.
And then the absolute unthinkable happened. Steve Jobs, the face, the co-founder, the visionary of Apple, was fired. Just let that sink in. The board he helped put together at the company he started in a garage sided against him. And just like that, he was out. Now imagine that's you. Your life's work just gone. What on earth do you do next?
You see, for most people, that would have been the end of the story. Game over. But for Steve Jobs, this crushing ordeal became a resurrection. His time away from Apple wasn't the end at all. It was actually a period of intense learning and getting ready for one of the greatest comeback stories in business history.
So what did he do? He started another computer company called Next. Now, commercially, it was a total failure, but the technology inside it was brilliant, and it taught him so much about building great software. At the same time, he bought a tiny computer graphics company from George Lucas. That company was called Pixar. He saw its potential and turned it into the animation studio that would give us Toy Story. Pixar taught him how to blend art and technology.
And, just as important, how to manage huge teams of brilliant, creative people. He wasn't just wandering in the desert. He was forging the very tools he'd need for his return.
So let's fast forward to 1997. Apple, the company that had pushed him out, was now literally on the verge of going bankrupt. It had totally lost its way, the products were boring, and it looked like it was all over. So, in a final desperate move, they made a massive decision. They bought Next, and in doing so, they brought Steve Jobs back home.
And with his return, the revolution began. He didn't just come back as the founder. He came back as a much more seasoned leader, one who had learned from the public failure of Next and the unbelievable success of Pixar. He was ready to remake Apple in his image.
The first shot fired, the iMac. In a world full of ugly beige computer boxes, this thing was a burst of color. It was beautiful, simple, all in one. It wasn't just a computer, it was a statement. It was Apple telling the world, we're back and creativity is king.
Next up, the iPod. Now, it wasn't the first MP3 player, not by a long shot, but it was the first one that was beautiful and incredibly easy to use. And with the iTunes Store, Apple didn't just sell you a gadget, it completely changed the entire music industry. It put, as he said, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And then, 2007. The device that didn't just change the game, it invented a whole new one, the iPhone. This wasn't just another product, it was like a new way of being. It was an iPod, a phone, and a real internet device all in one seamless little package. It completely rewired how we live, how we work, and how we connect with each other, cementing his legacy forever. So, what was the engine behind this incredible run of hits? It was his leadership style. Look, he was famously demanding, he was intense, he was obsessed with every tiny detail. But here's the thing you have to understand, it wasn't just about being a tough boss. His relentless drive for excellence created a culture where good enough was the absolute enemy. He pushed his teams further than they ever thought they could go, creating an environment where game-changing innovation wasn't just a goal, it was the only option. He demanded perfection, and he inspired a whole company to chase it right alongside him.
So, after all that, what can we, as leaders, as creators, as entrepreneurs, what can we actually take away from this incredible journey? Let's try to boil his life down into 5 key lessons you can start thinking about today.
First, stay curious. Never stop being that kid in the garage taking things apart just to see how they tick. That's where real breakthroughs come from. Second, follow what you love. Trust that even something that seems totally random, like that calligraphy class, has value. You just have to trust that the dots will connect later on. Third, don't fear failure. Getting fired from Apple was the worst thing that ever happened to him, but he later said it was a redirection that made him a beginner again, which led to his most creative period ever. Fourth, think different. I mean, that was their slogan, but it was also his entire philosophy. Don't just follow the crowd, question the road itself. And finally, number 5, never settle. That passion for making things insanely great is what separates the good from the legendary. It's that last 10% of effort that changes everything.
In the end, Steve Jobs' legacy is so much bigger than just a really successful company. He fundamentally changed our entire relationship with technology. He proved that when you combine technology with the arts, when engineering and design work together, you can create products that truly change the world.
So we end up right back where we started. He was just a curious kid in a garage who honestly believed he could put a dent in the universe. He was faced with humiliating failure, with exile, and he still came back to change everything. And that really only leaves one final question. This one's for you. So can you?